Alright y'all, welcome back to the channel and to some more buckshot testing. And today we've got another new shell that we've never tried before, and it's one that several of you guys have said that you've seen some pretty decent results from. So I'm definitely looking forward to testing these through this combination and a few others, just see what it can actually do. But as for the shell I've got here today, I picked up some of these. These are some of the Federal Premium copper plated buckshot shells. These ones in particular are the 12 gauge 2 3/4 inch 9 pellet load of double aught buck, moving about 1,325 feet per second. And specs wise, they're loaded pretty well identical to the Federal flight control shells. However, as far as I can tell, these ones do not have the flight control wad. Typically, when Federal puts it in one of their shells, they kind of plaster it all over their box, and this box has absolutely no mention of it anywhere on it. So if these copper plated shells don't have the flight control wad, I'm definitely interested to see how they perform, considering we know what the flight control loads can do. So definitely a pretty interesting thing out here today to test and see how they do. And as for the setup we've got to run them through today, of course, I brought out the Remington 1187 with the stock full choke in the gun. And this combination is pretty much what I use to get a baseline for most buckshot shells, especially ones that don't seem to be really loaded any kind of fancy way, kind of like these. So we know this is a proven and consistent setup. So we'll see what these can do starting through this factory full choke in the 1187 today. And as for today's test, everything is the same as we usually do it. I've got the big sheet of paper at 40 yards, as well as the chronograph and some templates we can lay up over our target to get that better reference point as to how they would have performed in some actual real life scenarios. So enough talking, let's take a shot with these 9 pellet copper plated Federal shells and just see what kind of a pattern we're able to get down there at 40 yards to set a baseline with. Okay, so that shell gave us 1196 through the chrono. The box claim is 1325, so we are a little bit under that claim, which is pretty surprising because Federal buckshot claims typically are pretty close to what we actually see. And I can tell you that that particular shell was a little bit lighter recoil than the equivalent shell in a flight control load. So maybe these are loaded a little touch less hot than those are. I don't know. It definitely wasn't, a squib load or anything, but they were a little touch lighter in the recoil department. But still, right at 1,200 feet per second is plenty good enough for double aught buck. So let's go down there and see what kind of a pattern we actually got. Alright, now we're down here at our 40-yard paper, and this is what we got. And definitely not too terrible overall, that's for sure. It's definitely not quite as good as what we've seen out of the flight control shells, but still, for a non-flight control load, that's not bad whatsoever. And I did measure our 2 farthest points across, and it is from the farthest left pellet to that top right pellet over there. And that spread gave us 16 3/4 inches at 40 yards. So definitely not quite as good as flight control shells, but I don't think we expected them to be either. But as for an overall size for a relatively basically loaded buckshot shell, that's not bad whatsoever. We have seen way worse. Now, of course, we can get nitpicky with it and say, well, yeah, that pattern isn't perfectly even by any means. We kind of have a clump or two over on the left with a couple little strings over on the right. So it's definitely not a perfectly even spread of pellets, but the overall size is absolutely usable out at 40 yards. But let's throw a couple templates up here just to see what it would look like in some more real life scenarios. Okay, so here's our 10-inch circle, and if we line it up with the actual core of our pattern, as you can see, it gave us 2 pellets within a 10-inch circle. By the numbers, definitely not great, but I think a lot of that plays into kind of how uneven the pattern actually is. The majority of the pellets that we're not seeing over here are all in the top left corner and along that left edge of that template right behind there. So they're not far off, but for the dead center core area of the pattern, definitely would like to see a couple more in there. But that doesn't always translate to a good usable hunting pattern. And speaking of hunting pattern, let's throw the deer template up here and see what it would look like if you would have actually taken this shot out in the field on a deer. Okay, and here's our deer template, and if we line it up with our point of aim, as you can see, if you would have taken this shot out in a hunting scenario, you would have had all 9 pellets within the deer. And definitely, I don't think that deer is going very far, if anywhere at all. You have 3 definite ones right through the lungs and heart area there, 1 a little bit in front of the heart, getting right into those big arteries that start up the neck. You had 1 through the neck, and several more that probably would have got somewhere close to the spine. So yeah, I definitely don't think that deer is going very very far on you, that's for sure. So definitely plenty good enough for deer hunting out to 40 or 50 yards all day long. But for the sake of doing it, let's also put the hog template up here and just see what it would look like if you were to use these shells in a hog hunting scenario. Okay, here's that hog template, and as you can already see, it's pretty much the same story. You have all 9 of them within there at 40 yards, and that's a dead hog all day long. So clearly, although these shells are definitely not quite as good as the flight control shells, like I've already said, they're still plenty good enough and usable enough of a hunting load out to that 40 to 50 yard range. And with them being a 2 3/4 inch shell and a little bit lighter in the recoil department, that's a very usable hunting shell. So overall, that's for results here. Not the best buckshot pattern we've ever gotten, but still very solid and very usable. I do wish it was a little bit more evenly spread, having a couple more of those pellets in the core, but considering the overall size of the pattern, it's gonna still get the job done for you. So not bad overall here, and for a starting point with that stock full choke, I definitely think we're on the right track. Okay, and here's the wad that was actually in those shells. And if you've seen or tried any of the Federal Shorty shells, I believe this is probably very close to the same wad they use. I don't have one on hand, but based on our testing, it's extremely similar either way. Definitely not a full-length wad, much shorter than your typical 2 3/4 or 3-inch wads. It's got a little bit of rigidity to it, but the pedals are a little bit thin. Either way, definitely nothing too fancy to see, and for being as basic as it is, I think it did about as good of a job as what it could have done. So now I'm definitely curious to see what this wad with those plated pellets actually do through something like a ported buck kicker choke. It may help it, it may hurt it, it may do weird things, I don't know, but definitely pretty interesting to see here. All right, y'all. Well, what did you think about that pattern right there? I'd say it's a pretty good starting point, and it's a very usable pattern. It's not the ultimate best buckshot pattern we've ever gotten. It's not as good as the Federal Flight Control shells were through that exact same setup and choke combo, but I don't think we expected it to be either. If that's the setup you had, yeah, you could absolutely hunt deer or hogs or whatever with it out to 40 to 50 yards all day long and be just fine. But I do think with the right choke, we can tune that in just a little bit better, or at least make it maybe a little bit more even where we have a couple more of those pellets actually in our core area, which is kind of what I like to see. But as always, let me know your thoughts about it down in the comments. Is that about what you expected to see? Were you a little surprised one way or the other? Have you tested any of the 2 3/4 inch 9 pellet plated Federal buckshot shells? And if so, what kind of results have you seen from them? Would you hunt with that kind of a pattern? Or would you want to see it a little bit more condensed? And is there another choke or setup combo that you want to see us run those shells through? Let me know all that down below. But with that being said, I've got some more testing to get done for you guys, so I'm going to get back to it. As always, we have the channel Instagram as well as the mailbox where you can send stuff if you'd like. All that information will be in the description down below if you're interested in it. But I'm going to get back to it, so I'll see y'all in the next one.